The evacuation of New Meridian Colony was descending into chaos. Human Marine Corporal Jake Reston's squad was covering civilian withdrawal routes, while Krell forces advanced through the outer districts, their bombardment making orderly evacuation increasingly impossible. Jake's team had secured a landing zone for civilian transports when he heard it, crying, coming from a partially collapsed residential building near the evacuation perimeter. Most civilians had already been evacuated from this sector, but apparently someone had been missed. "Rivera, maintain position," Jake ordered his second. "I'm checking that building." "We're supposed to be falling back in 5 minutes," Rivera protested. "Then I'll make it quick." Jake moved through the damaged structure with practiced caution, following the sound of frightened crying to a storage room where he found her. A small alien girl, perhaps 6 years old in human terms, huddled beneath a collapsed shelving unit. She was Thessari, based on her long pointed ears and violet eyes. She wore simple civilian clothing now covered in dust, and she was clearly terrified, crying in a language Jake didn't speak but whose meaning was universal, a frightened child calling for help. "Hey," Jake said quietly, kneeling to her level and keeping his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "I'm here to help. I'm going to get you out of here." The girl stared at him, this armored human stranger speaking a language she didn't understand, and Jake saw her weighing whether to trust him. He extended his hand slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. "It's okay. I promise I'll keep you safe." Something in his tone or expression must have resonated because the girl slowly reached out and took his hand. Jake carefully extracted her from beneath the shelving unit, checking her for injuries and finding only minor cuts and bruises. Then he heard the sound he'd been dreading, incoming artillery, close enough that the building shook. No time for gentle reassurance. Jake scooped the girl up, held her securely against his chest, and ran. The route back to the landing zone took them through sections of the colony that were actively being shelled. Jake moved with combat efficiency, using cover when available, running through open areas when necessary, his body positioned to shield the girl from debris and weapons fire. She clung to him with desperate strength, her face pressed against his armor, clearly terrified but trusting him to protect her. Jake reached the landing zone just as the last civilian transport was preparing to lift off. He ran toward it, shouting for them to wait, and the crew chief, seeing him carrying a child, held the boarding ramp. Jake carried the girl up the ramp, found a Thessari woman who seemed responsible and calm, and carefully handed the child over. "Take care of her," Jake said, though he doubted the woman spoke standard. "Make sure she gets somewhere safe." The girl looked at him with wide violet eyes, reaching back toward him as the woman held her. Jake gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile, then turned and ran back down the ramp before the transport could be delayed further. His squad was already falling back to the final evacuation point. Jake rejoined them without mentioning the detour, just another crisis handled in a day full of them. The colony was abandoned hours later, human and allied forces conducting a fighting withdrawal while Krell forces occupied the ruins. Jake's squad made it out alive, regrouped with their unit, and moved on to the next deployment. Jake thought about the Thessari girl occasionally, hoped she'd made it to safety, wondered if she'd been reunited with her family. But he never expected to see her again, or to be remembered for what he'd considered just doing his job. 3 weeks later, Jake's commanding officer summoned him with an expression suggesting something unusual was happening. "Corporal Reston, you've been requested for a formal audience by Queen Solara of the Thessari Empire." Jake blinked. "I'm sorry, sir, what?" "Apparently, you rescued someone important during the New Meridian evacuation. The Thessari have been searching for you since. They've requested your presence at their embassy for an official audience with the Queen herself." The Thessari embassy on the diplomatic station was elaborate, all flowing architecture and bioluminescent decorations that suggested both power and grace. Jake was escorted through formal halls by guards in ceremonial armor to a private audience chamber where Queen Solara waited. The queen was striking, tall, elegant, with long pointed ears marked by ceremonial jewelry and violet eyes that studied Jake with fierce intensity. Beside her stood a small girl who Jake recognized immediately, the child he'd rescued from New Meridian. The girl gasped when she saw him, her face lighting up with recognition and joy. She said something in Thessari that Jake couldn't understand, but the emotion was clear. Queen Solara spoke in perfect standard, her voice carrying both authority and carefully controlled emotion. Corporal Jake Reston of the Earth Colonial Marines. 3 weeks ago, you rescued my daughter, Princess Lyra, from New Meridian Colony during the Krell assault. You risked your life to extract her from a collapsing building and carried her to safety through active bombardment without knowing her identity or expecting any reward. Jake felt his stomach drop. The frightened child he'd found was a princess. Your Majesty, I didn't know she was royalty. She was just a kid who needed help. Precisely, Queen Solara said. You protected her because she was a child in danger, not because she was my daughter. You risked your life without calculating political advantage or expecting recognition. Among my people, this creates what we call Cathara Velthara, the sacred bond of protection. The queen stepped closer, her expression carrying weight that suggested what came next was significant. When someone saves a member of the royal family, particularly a direct heir, without knowing their identity and without expectation of reward, they earn a place in our house that cannot be refused or dismissed. This is ancient law, maintained for thousands of years. She paused, studying Jake carefully. I offer you a choice, Corporal Reston, though by our law it is a choice you cannot truly refuse without dishonoring both yourself and the bond you created. You may accept formal adoption into House Thessari as guardian brother to Princess Lyra, with all the rights, obligations, and authority that position carries. Or you may accept exile from Thessari space, never to return, thus severing the bond through your own choice. Jake processed this, adoption into the royal family. Not as heir, Queen Solara clarified, but as guardian brother, someone bound to protect Princess Lyra as you demonstrated you would do instinctively, someone granted authority within our house to act on her behalf, someone who becomes part of our family through deed rather than blood. Princess Lyra stepped forward, looking up at Jake with eyes that carried hope and trust. Through a translator, she spoke. You saved me. You carried me and kept me safe when I was frightened. You promised you would protect me, and you did. Please, please don't leave. Jake looked at the young princess, at the child he'd carried through bombardment, who trusted him when she had every reason to be terrified. Then at Queen Solara, who was offering him something far more complicated than simple reward. What exactly does guardian brother mean? Jake asked. What are the obligations? You would be bound to protect Princess Lyra and House Thessari, Queen Solara explained. You would have authority to speak in family councils, to advise on matters affecting the princess's welfare, to act with royal backing when protecting her interests. You would be family, with all that entails, obligations certainly, but also belonging, authority, and status that few outsiders ever achieve. She paused. But you would also be bound. Your life would no longer be entirely your own. Your choices would carry implications for our house. You would be expected to prioritize Lyra's safety and the family's honor above personal considerations when those values conflict. Jake was quiet, processing the magnitude of what was being offered, what was being demanded. And if I refuse, accept exile, then you would never again be permitted in Thessari space. The bond would be broken by your choice, and you would be seen as someone who rejected the sacred obligation created by your own actions. This would not be punishment, but recognition that you chose freedom over duty. Queen Solara's voice softened slightly. I will not force you, Corporal Reston, but I will ask you to consider that you demonstrated a quality rare in the galaxy. You protected a child without knowing her worth to others, purely because she needed protection. That character is exactly what makes you worthy of the position I offer." Jake looked at Lyra again, at her hopeful expression, at the trust she'd placed in him during the evacuation. He thought about what adoption into a royal family would mean. The complications, the obligations, the binding of his future to people and duties he'd never anticipated. But he also thought about the moment he'd found her crying in that collapsed building, and how he'd never considered for even a second leaving her there. "I accept," Jake said quietly. "If she needs someone to protect her, to be her guardian brother, I can do that. I will do that." Relief and satisfaction crossed Queen Solara's face. "Then, by the authority vested in me as sovereign of the Thessari Empire, I declare you, Jake Reston of Earth, adopted into House Thessari as guardian brother to Princess Lyra. You are bound to our family, granted authority to speak and act on our behalf, and recognized as protector to the heir of our throne." She extended her hand in formal gesture. "Welcome to our family, guardian brother. You have earned this place through character demonstrated when you believed no one would remember or reward it. That is exactly why you deserve it." Over the following months, Jake navigated his new reality with the same practical competence he applied to everything else. He maintained his marine service. The Thessari respected military duty, but now also attended family councils, advised on security protocols for Princess Lyra, and gradually learned what it meant to be part of a royal house. Lyra became his constant shadow when he visited the Thessari homeworld, treating him with the absolute trust of someone who'd been saved at their most vulnerable moment, and knew that trust was deserved. "You're my guardian brother," Lyra told him during one visit, her standard improving rapidly through practice. "That means your family, not because of blood, but because you chose to save me when you didn't have to." Jake looked at the young princess, at the responsibility he'd accidentally taken on through a simple act of decency during a chaotic evacuation. "Yeah," he agreed. "I guess I did." Some bonds are formed through careful negotiation and strategic alliance, some through blood and tradition, and some are created in moments of crisis, when someone risks everything to save a frightened child without knowing that child is royalty, proving that the strongest family ties are often the ones we earn through instinct and character, rather than the ones we're born into. The human soldier who rescued a princess during evacuation